a recent post, this is obviously going to start with the Gaza attack, and then at some point, I'm sure we'll rewind all the way back to the 19th century. So, in a recent post, you compared the Hamas attack on Israeli civilians to the Nat Turner slave rebellion. You wrote that Turner exhorted his fellow insurrectionists to kill all white people. You said a whole families, fathers, mothers, and daughters, sucking babies, and school children were butchered, thrown into heaps. And you say that Turner's rage was ascribed by White to his religious delirium, so as to obscure the slave uprising's real taproot, not fanatical delusion, but the system of bondage that stoked the flames for vengeance. And then you continue to draw an analogy between Nat Turner, a psychological analogy, I would say, to what happened with the Hamas uprising. And I'll read from it, or I can let you read from it if you want, because, okay. The 2,000 young men who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th, 2023, had been born into a concentration camp. For fully 2 decades, they had been immersed in a 25-mile long by 5-mile wide sliver of land that was among the most densely populated places in the world. The vast majority of them could never hope to leave, but only to pace each day the camp's suffocating perimeter, never aspire to gainful employment or eat a full meal, never expect to marry or raise a family. Abandoned by everyone, they were remaindered to languish and die. To expedite this process, Israel periodically launched operations visiting death and destruction on Gaza. Thousands methodically mowed down, homes and critical infrastructure systematically pulverized. It might sound like the script of a bad B movie, but on the night of October 6th, each of those 2,000 men probably kissed his mother, then his father goodbye forever. And then each silently vowed to vindicate the remorseless torture of a twilight existence and to avenge the murder of a grandparent, sister, brother, niece, nephew by that satanic power that cursed their lives. So you're offering what I think is a psychological defense there, somewhere along the lines of pleading down from premeditated murder through manslaughter, maybe even to some kind of justifiable homicide. So tell us about that and why you wrote that.
On October 7th, when I first heard about the events, they were described as Hamas members, militants, whatever you want, breaking through the gates of Gaza. And they estimated on the first day about 50 people were killed. It wasn't clear how they were killed, whether they were targeted, whether it was crossfire. So my initial reaction was people broke free of a concentration camp, an open-air prison, whichever term you prefer. And of course, I was very sympathetic. In fact, instinctively, I turned to that Civil War song, John Brown's Body Lies a-Moldering in the Grave. And one of the lines in the lyrics is, the gods above in heaven are looking kindly down. But by day 2 or day 3, it became clear that something different had happened, or at least something of a very different order of magnitude. And at that point, I had to, in my own mind, try to make a moral judgment as to what, we don't know the details, but we know enough to know that something of an atrocity of a significant magnitude had occurred. And at that point, I was at a loss for analogies. My first thought was my parents. They were in concentration camps during World War II. My father was in Auschwitz and my mother was in Majdanek. So I tried to picture in my mind what would their verdict be on what happened. That was very speculative, though I'm pretty certain what their verdict would be, but we'll leave that aside because it is speculative. The next thing I did was, recently I've been reading a lot of American history, in particular African-American history, and everybody knows Nat Turner's rebellion. It was the largest slave rebellion in American history. And I knew it to be very gruesome. Actually, until I read Stephen Oates' biography of Nat Turner, I didn't realize how gruesome it was. He gave the order to kill all whites, and they proceeded to behead a lot of babies. It was very ugly. okay, now the analogies seem close, though I don't think the evidence is in the Hamas militants beheaded Israeli babies. That's still a very gray area. But clearly there was a level of ugliness that the analogy seemed to hold. And then my next question is, okay, so what was the verdict, the historic verdict on what happened with Nat Turner? And my first impulse was, okay, let me go see what the abolitionists had to say. The abolitionists referred to those heroic whites who gave over their lives to trying to end slavery. People like Charles Sumner, William Lloyd Garrison, Thaddeus Stevens, and so forth. And what struck me when I went over to look at what they said, when you look at, for example, William Lloyd Garrison, who is the editor of that famous newspaper called The Liberator, I was quite surprised. I have to say it was a kind of a relief for me that whereas Garrison does state that atrocities had occurred, that horrors had unfolded, if you read closely every word of what he wrote, never once, it's very conspicuous, he never once condemned the slave revolt. He condemned all the hypocrites who suddenly became very pious about atrocities. He said that we warned you, we told you so, you leave these people in this condition, there's going to be a catastrophe. And so when I read that, I felt that was the correct verdict. And then I went on to look at C.L.R. James, what he have to say about the Haitian Revolution, in which whites were systematically targeted in very large numbers. And he said as well, what happened is clearly an atrocity, but he refused to condemn the slave uprising. And for me, that was the right way to try to come to grips with what happened. I have one advantage or disadvantage over virtually every other person listening to this program, and maybe every other person, not just virtually. That is, I spent the last 20 years reading through those human rights reports on Gaza, reading through the reports after each of Israel's massacres in Gaza, what it likes to call operations, reading through each of Israel's murderous destruction of the people trapped in Gaza, what Israelis like to call mowing the lawn, each time it launches one of its murderous assaults. And people thought that was very funny, mowing the lawn. Isn't that cute? Isn't that clever? And then it occurred to me the other day, you know what Hamas did on October 7th? It mowed the lawn. Is that funny? Is that funny? Is that an object of humor? Why does it suddenly become disgusting if it describes what Hamas did? But since 2007, I'm not going to even go through all the other massacres, even though I have a pretty good memory. I cannot try as I may. I can't remember the names of all the massacres.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to,
Yes.
So, and before I turn to Eli, when you said you were relieved to find that Garrison said that, you relieved why?
I was relieved because knowing as I do, after having studied the situation for 2 decades, knowing as I do the situation in Gaza, I couldn't find it in me to condemn the actions of those concentration camp victims. I couldn't do it.
Okay. So this issue of psychological frame of mind, I want to come back to this throughout this conversation, because at every period, the actors we're going to talk about have their own psychology, and some of them may be comparable to what you're describing. But go ahead, your response.
Well, for those who are watching, what you just heard from Mr. Finkelstein is utterly demented and historically illiterate. The Gazans are not slaves. Gaza is not a concentration camp. And I have read your books, not all of them, but I have read enough. And you rely selectively only on the most anti-Israel sources, and you never account for the agency of the criminal gang that currently runs Gaza. And so this allows you to.
All right, so I was gonna watch kind of a substantive chunk of Eli's response here, and then kind of after they'd I figured that once they'd both said their piece about the sort of opening issue, then we'd pause to comment on it. But I'm just kind of from the way we've gotten rolling here, I think I have a pretty good sense of how the next several minutes are going to go, and so I don't think that's going to work out because I mean, you've seen the whole thing. Tell me if I'm wrong. But my guess here is that he says a bunch of stuff denying the factual premises of what Norm just said, and then Norm defends the factual premises. Norm points out, not only I'm going to resist the temptation to do a Norm impression here. Not only did I not not only do I not selectively rely on the most anti-Israel sources, I've quoted this, that, and the other thing, that I've looked at the, the IDF's own estimate of this and that, right? That's kind of how I would see the next few minutes going.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
I mean, yeah.
So given that, right? I'm sure we're going to have some fun with that. But I do want to, I do want to, comment on the first chunk of this, right? Because it's because there are two, there are two issues here. One is how bad is what Gaza is put through, and then two is kind of what follows from that about 10-7, and there is a really substantive argument to be had about two, but you can only have it once you've acknowledged one, right? In other words, that this is Eli Lake just kind of isn't in the conversation about two because he's in denial about one. So I would just kind of say, just to kind of put my own 2 cents on the table here, I do have a disagreement with Norm here about two, not about one. He's absolutely right about one, but I do have a disagreement with Norm about two that mirrors, if you watch from the first time it came on the show, he and I ended up having an hour-long kind of impromptu debate on air about Russia and Ukraine, and it kind of mirrors the structure of that, right? That in that case, I've certainly spent the last year and a half strongly advocating for a ceasefire and peace negotiations in Ukraine, and I've spent a year and a half being called a Putin apologist, my trouble. So there is definitely some agreement there, but at the same time, and I even agree with the premise that it's not wrong to say that U.S. policy made the situation worse in the years leading up to it, and that's part of the explanation of what happened. But there is still a disagreement that I have with him about, okay, what should we then say about the Russian invasion? And I still think, well, no, that's not justified. We wouldn't have if you kind of imagine the closest possible analogy to I don't know, kind of make it Mexico trying to join the Warsaw Pact or something, the three of us and Norm would all be marching in anti-war protests. I support the anti-war movement in Russia, so I won't take you through the sort of details of that debate. People can just look that up. Right? Was that?
I've seen it as well. Yeah.
So people can just look that up if they're curious about it, right? So I think there's a parallel disagreement here. Next time he's on the show, happy to talk to him about that. But is that given one, right? Given that it is just that bad in Gaza, which it is. What follows about Hamas and 10-7? And I'll say, like, what I kind of said in that Jacobin article that I mentioned earlier, solidarity with Palestine means recognizing the Palestinians are a monolith. What I said in the monologue I did about this on the show, on 10/9, is that you can have, you can acknowledge that this is not something that came out of nowhere, that this is a part that, the atrocities on 10/7 were part of a cycle of atrocities and counter atrocities that started long before that the cycle of violence is rooted in the sort of very violent system of apartheid that Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, to a lesser but still very real degree even within Israel itself, are subjected to. You can acknowledge all of that, right? Which you should, because that's all true, right? And still say, no, look, I'm not just going to say, well, the Palestinians did this, so like I support the Palestinians, so I'm not going to condemn it. No, Hamas did that, right? This specific Palestinian organization that's not a organic expression of the rage of, grassroots members. It's a hierarchical top-down organization. It's motivated by a particular, ideology. It has a particular way of seeing the world. I'm just going to quote very briefly from what I said in that, that opening monologue. When you say the Israelis do this or that, presumably you mean that the Israeli state does it. But there's no Palestinian state for you to talk about when you say the Palestinians are doing this or that. There are two Palestinian factions, Hamas and Fatah, that each exercise some level of control over different bits of territory, lots of Palestinian factions that don't control much of anything. And of course, all the millions of individual Palestinians, and like every other ethnicity in the world, they don't all have the same political opinions. There are Palestinians who are Marxists, Palestinians who are Islamic fundamentalists, Palestinians who are pan-Arab nationalists, there's a whole gamut, including tons of Palestinians who condemned Hamas's tactics. The Palestinians who are ideologically closest to what we stand for here, right, the three of us, for instance, are the ones whose long-term vision of justice is a secular and democratic vision with equal rights for everybody who lives there. That means Palestinian Muslims and Christians and Israeli Jews, Thai guest workers, Druze, everyone. And of course, Palestinians who with those politics would never think an Israeli civilian's ethnicity or citizenship made them an appropriate target for collective revenge because they see those people as part of the polity they want to build. Just like the South African communists, for example, recruited both white and black South Africans and understood that white people are part of the future post-apartheid nation they wanted to build because they were serious people. And I kind of go on to point out, right, that like there are people who are killed on 10/7 who are like principled anti-Zionist, Israeli leftists, who in many cases, who have all this exact same politics three of us do, but have had to make much bigger sacrifices for those politics, like going to prison for not serving in the military, and just the it's and I would just say just to wrap up the thought, right, that when you think about this, and I do want to, I don't want to straw man Norm's position, right, because I understand he's not saying he supports this,
or
right?
Eli's for that matter.
Yeah, sure, or Eli's, although that's that would be harder, is my suspicion. But in any case, they have a but I think that so he's not supporting Hamas's atrocities. He's saying that he's not going to condemn it, and we just heard the argument, but but I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like if somebody like if your mom is an American citizen and somebody killed her in revenge for America's many atrocities around the world, you'd feel comfortable condemning it, right? That they have
I think I would feel more anger towards my own government for provoking it.
Well, you don't have to pick.
I don't know about that. Yeah, I think
I don't think you have to pick. That maybe that's our disagreement here.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. I mean, I think what you said, I think we would all agree with that. Hamas does not reflect Palestinians. I think that we could all get on board with, and I think in some ways that's an easy thing to point out. And in fairness to Eli Lake, I should say that he tries to point out in his own argument that he's talking about Hamas, not Palestinians, he also tries to apologize for Israeli officials who are talking about both by saying that they're just talking about Hamas, which is not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and I see like coalescence in the chat.
But I think that's the easy argument, you know.
It's a the whole comment is not safe for work, so I won't highlight it. But like the sort of substance of the comment is about the Chomskyan point that we should focus on the things that we're best positioned to do something about, relatively speaking. Although we shouldn't exaggerate that, because it's not like the American public.
Well, not only that,
hold on, gets to vote on American foreign policy. If so, by the way, there would already be a ceasefire, because like 2/3 of Americans support that. But they have but yeah, look, it does make sense to the extremely limited extent that we could influence anything. We could do, what we influence is the American government. So that would be a good enough reason for us to focus on it to begin with. And when you add the sort of the fact that the U.S., or in this case, the U.S. and its proxy Israel, are by far the purveyors of the most violence, it makes even more sense to focus on it, right? So to be clear, coalescence, I totally agree with that, right? I absolutely agree with that, right? Like, I think it's worth kind of taking a second to disagree with people who say, as in this case, you're not going to condemn it or whatever, because it's like, no, I think that's wrong, right? But but look, if the question is what should you spend 99.999% of your focus on, totally agree, right? It should be the action of the actions of the U.S. and its client state in in this instance. But I do think that it's like sort of both morally and strategically a bad idea to, I think it's like kind of wrong in itself, because it's like, yeah, look, if you're like a Palestinian Marxist who wants there to be a single secular democratic state with equal rights for everybody, obviously you're not going to start killing random Israeli civilians, because that won't reflect your politics. Whereas if you're like a theocratic, socially conservative, whatever, right, then it will reflect your politics. You're more likely to do it. That's one thing, right? But it's like, also, I think that it's both morally and tactically a bad idea to blur that point, because it's like, look, for the purposes of the primary task, which is condemning the things the U.S. is facilitating Israel in doing, I think that maintaining this kind of clear, bright line, that it's like, if there's one principle you do not want to fucking budge on, it's this absolute prohibition on killing civilians, which is going to be, the heart of our, objection to what the U.S. is facilitating Israel doing. So it's like, I think it's a bad idea. I think it's self-defeating to like chip away at that absolute that sort of absolute line, and and sort of make it seem like we're just kind of turning that principle on and off as the situation dictates.
I suppose I agree. Well, I agree with the broad point, and I also feel at the same time, like, I don't know. So I think when we're talking about Gazans and Palestinians, I agree all around with what you just said. And I think that's sort of the easy argument to make. That's for this audience, for the three of us, that's, we all agree with that. I think the harder question is like, I don't claim to know what Hamas was supposed to do. Given, like, when we look at your, the number 1 and 2 arguments that you, number 1 and 2 points that you made, given number 1, I almost feel like it would be condescending of me to claim that I know what Hamas should do about number 2,
Yeah, I guess I would just point out that we do say that, right? Like in other situations, like, we have no problem, nor should we, I think, have a problem saying, like, to somebody who's an Israeli who, like, maybe, I mean, look, if you think about, like, I don't know, I have like a 6-month-old nephew, if I watch somebody, like kill that nephew in front of me, right? Intentionally target him and kill him, then I might very well lose my mind and sign up for a military force to like go kill whoever did that, right?
Yeah.
Like, but I'm still comfortable saying no, but I'm still against that, right? I still have a problem with that. Like, what I might do if I were in that situation is one question, but third person perspective, what I think should be done is a different question. And I'd also point out that it's like, even on 10-7, they were also attacking military targets. And so the question is, well, did they get anything out of doing this that out of, killing teenagers at a concert or whatever that, like, did that benefit them in some way, right? Like not just that sort of, was that of some sort of strategic benefit to them? And it's hard to say how, right? And even to use one of Norm's own historical analogies, right? Like when after the Haitian Revolution, when in the late stages of that, right? So they'd fought off the French, and then they have at the Toussaint was long gone, right? So this guy Jean-Jacques Dessalines was in power, and after he'd completely taken over the island, as like part of the mopping up, he ordered these massacres of with some exceptions for different communities that were spared for different reasons, right? But he ordered these massacres of the French and other white populations on the island. It's like, look, did that benefit Haiti in some way? I mean, this is like, in fact, many of his own soldiers were, many of his own officers initially refused to carry out the order because they were horrified by it. He actually had to kind of go on this tour, like getting them to do it, I would, anyway, that would be my argument on number 2 here. I'm sure we can go back to it if there's anything else you want to throw in, or actually, Rob.
Yeah.
Haven't heard much from you lately. So do you have any thoughts about this before we move on?
Yeah, I was mostly ready to make fun of the debaters, but I didn't know you guys are going to talk about like actual philosophical problems of resistance and revolution. So, guess I'll throw out what I was going to talk about. I think that's a natural thing that, we could disagree with Finkelstein about. Like, I always feel like Norman often draws like especially bold conclusions from his ironclad, impeccable research. So I feel like that's like a legitimate thing that people can legitimately disagree with. I mean, I think that to me, if someone like raised that question, I have a similar response to Matt earlier, which was like, what are they supposed to do? Like, why didn't they do Gandhian nonviolent resistance? When people say that, they're indicating that they have no fucking idea what's been going on for the previous 56 years. I mean, Palestinians doing nonviolent resistance, that was 2018. That was the March of Return. And people in journalism clearly marked journalism jackets, and first responding medical emergency workers just got straight up sniped in giant numbers. You have Israeli snipers bribing about taking knees and stuff. I mean, and that was them doing nonviolent resistance. Your snipers were bragging about taking their knees. And then 5 years later, some of them break out in an insane murder rage. They do this huge, ugly October 7th Hamas massacre. Again, I think on principle and on grounds of how this needs to be argued to make any kind of political steps, we have to draw the line at that targeting civilians thing, as you said, Ben. I think that it is really hard to make that case. And if anyone could, it would be Norman. So we'll let him do it. But like, that is the thing everyone reaches for is like, well, if they have grievances, why didn't they go through channels like the United Nations and nonviolent resistance? And like, it's hard for me not to spit in your eye right now. It's nice liberal interlocutor, just indicating you get your news from NPR. You never heard anything about Palestine that didn't come in a 90-second format. Yeah, you're not going to know the facts of this.
Yeah, you've never heard of the Great March of Return. You don't know that there were like.
Yeah, I mean, that's, if you want to like do anything about this, you have to address what they were supposed to do that.
And when they did that,
just like mowed down for unarmed, getting too close to the
border. You shot them for coming up to their side of the border. Like, you shoot them all the time. All of this is happening because of 1,000 odd dead Israeli civilians, which is horrible. But that's how many you guys killed in 2018 with, that was just that era of just that period of bombing Gaza. And that happens like every other year with the mowing the lawn, as Norman said earlier. So I'm eager to get back to the actual debate here and let. I'm sure Eli's going to really put Norm on his toes there. I think he's really going to give him a lot. But I have one other thing to say. I feel like I often make trivial, jokey points in this debate commentary, and that is totally unfair if anyone has ever said that. But I do think it's very funny that this important debate with people dying. This important debate is not happening at SUNY. It's not happening at one of the many private colleges in New York. It's happening in the fucking Comedy Cellar. I hope that Norman and Eli can hurry up with their little debatey whatever, because Rich Voss is coming up tonight. Going to have a great set. Louis C.K.'s got some fresh material. Come on out. I don't know if we want to lose our place here, but if we go back briefly to the moderator who's doing his best, to keep an even keel on an emotional issue, who's over his shoulder as he attempts to balance the difficult, profound geopolitical questions? Fat, stupid Bob Kelly's face. That's who's over his shoulder, which to me, it's funny because I'm used to the Comedy Cellar as being a thing that dumb comics say to see them at when they're on funny talk shows. But that's what we've been forced to resort to actually get a real critic of Israeli policy on. It's like, well, you certainly can't come to the private or public higher ed institutions, but you can go down to Chuckles Comedy Chortle Hut, where, hurry up with that so you can see Nick DiPaolo after this debate. It's good.
Yeah, no, I guess the moderator kind of said this at the beginning in a much milder and less funny way, that it's like, you would think that this would be happening all the time right now, this conversation, and yet, because they just, media mostly just has guys like Eli Lake on who would normally know better than to agree to this conversation. So on the sort of on the question of lost. So on the on the previous subject of debate, I think we've kind of heard extensively from from Norm, and then from me, and then from Maddie, that we've gotten a good survey of the positions. I'm pretty happy to leave that there, and the main arguments for them. But I would just say two things before we go back to the debate and give Matthew a chance to pee in any case, which are one, I would just point out that the question of specifically targeting civilians is a different question for the question of armed struggle versus pacifism, right? Those are two different issues, right? So secondly, it is amazing the way that, some people online will, hear a position that, and just kind of make something up to attribute it to, but it's, saw somebody in the, in the chat being like, oh, Ben's like justifying Israeli colonialism. It's like, motherfucker,
You're always doing that, Ben. You're always, whenever I see you, you're always doing that. Lay off.
This is the single subject I've been having political arguments about for the longest in my life. Right? Is this one? I had an article 2 years ago out in Jacobin on the case for a one state solution. I have today in Jacobin, I have a article out, in defense of Rashida Tlaib called "From the River to the Sea" is a call for democracy and equality.
It just says free. It doesn't say only Palestinians. It just says free, you fucking idiots. You're censuring the best congressperson for the stupidest fucking reason. Like, oh my God. Sorry, you were saying. I interrupted.
That's good stuff. That's good stuff. Don't be sorry about that. No, exactly. So yeah, I have I think I think I made my position on this pretty fucking clear. And I have no doubt whatsoever that there are many very clear, very calm and sane and rational emails that are already being composed that I'll wake up to in my inbox tomorrow morning from people who have sane and rational responses to this article, which usually happens when I write about this stuff. But in any case, let's go back to the debate.
Make these, performative moral judgments, comparing it to Nat Turner's slave rebellion or what have you. But you are only able to do this because although you have assembled voluminous amounts of information, you have been totally unwilling to ever ascribe any agency to the people that have started this latest war and have started so many of these other wars. So in that respect, I have to say that I'm at a loss as to why you just insist on describing the world's only Jewish state in such demonic terms. And it has consequences, because I believe that the people who have joined these demonstrations, shouting from the river to the sea, in some cases celebrating this massive brutality, they are in many ways your children and grandchildren, intellectually speaking, because you have provided a kind of narrative and framework to not only delegitimize, but to really demonize the only Jewish state. It is a standard to which no other country is held, and you have decided to do it. Does Israel kill innocent civilians? Yes, every army does. But your telling of this story, that every single time the Palestinians are victims and have no role whatsoever in provoking these kinds of conflicts or even being an actor in any of these kinds of conflicts, and your massing of evidence that only seems to go against Israel and never seems to sort of acknowledge things that almost everybody else who has looked at this has knowledge, such as the use of human shields by Hamas. I think it's self-discrediting. That's what I would say.
Okay. Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
So he's bringing up psychology, and in the law, we recognize psychology. You told me earlier today about a story about when the concentration camps were liberated, how they came and they murdered the soldiers.
Justifiably.
What's that?
Justifiably.
Justified. So where do you feel that his analogy fails? Because not everybody knows these facts the way you do.
Well, I mean, first of all, Israel has provided fuel. Israel has provided electricity. Israel has provided water. And it is this notion that there is this siege of Gaza, which is so inhumane. I've been to Gaza. Granted, I was there 10 years ago. You can find luxury hotels. You can find shopping centers. And you can find incredibly impoverished refugee camps. Now, there are probably a lot of reasons, and I think Israel does have some responsibility for the poor conditions in those camps. However, why is it that in your analysis, you do not blame the group that siphons off development aid, that has done everything it can to, let's just say, immiserate Palestinians, in the sense that not only do they rule the Gaza Strip, as you would expect fanatic fascists would, but they also start these wars, which Israel retaliates. So you look at this massacre and you say, aha, they were mowing the lawn. I look at this massacre and I say, you are a false friend of the Palestinians. This was an obvious sort of decision from Hamas with no consultation from the people of Gaza themselves. And by the way, Hamas is underneath Gaza City in tunnels, somewhat secure from the aerial bombardment. They have stockpiled food and fuel, of course, which they are not giving to the average citizens. They knew that there would be a response, especially something this vicious. So, of course, you are explaining away the worst pogrom against Jews since the Holocaust. But you are also, it's a slur against Palestinians if you think this is some sort of authentic representation of what Palestinians want. You think that they want this kind of thing? You think that this would not provoke a response from a far more powerful military?
Is it an authentic representation of the psychology of the people in Hamas who did this?
The people in Hamas, I mean, what are we talking about? A terrorist is an overused word. I think that we have to look at Hamas right now as an organization of Anders Breiviks. It's a group of mass shooters at this point. So again, if you care about the Palestinians, why have you never devoted a single word to getting rid of this disgusting fascist organization that
I'm going to try not to stop this often, but I just wanted to say that's an interesting analogy. If you accept his premise there about Anders Breivik and mass shooters, like, okay, sure, if the cops don't have any way of stopping a mass shooter except to shoot them, right? We accept that's fine. They can shoot them, but if a mass shooter, say, hides in the basement of a hospital, we wouldn't think that the NYPD was justified in wiping out the hospital, right? Like, this is the the mass shooter analogy, I think is not going to get him where he wants to go.
And plenty of officials claim they don't know where the militants are hiding.
Right.
and also let's just also, I mean, just to go back to the beginning, like, the fact that he calls them a group of mass shooters, again, I think, like, illustrates the imbalance of forces in a way that is really grotesque. You have the strongest military power in the Middle East backed by the strongest military power in human history with diplomatic and economic support, waging a war, waging what I would call genocide, or just wage a war against a group that their side is describing as a group of mass shooters. I think it illustrates the imbalance of forces really well.
Yeah, and it's also pretty rich to be saying, well, we don't want a bunch of fanatical fascists, so you got to support Israel and the Likud government.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing again. Ben earlier showed his article about Rashida Tlaib, but it's extra insane because, she sang a song with a sentence that could be very arguably construed as supporting ethnic cleansing. The government of Israel, like numerous cabinet and parliamentary officials, are saying, yeah, ethnic cleansing. We should cleanse Gaza ethnically. A racial resolution or an ultimate resolution. That's good. An ultimate resolution. Right?
Ultimate resolution, yeah. No, it is fascinating how I keep hearing the last few weeks about, okay, well, look, this cabinet member said something super genocidal, but they're not like an important cabinet minister. They're just a very minor one, so that doesn't really count. And they're like,
only the education secretary. It's not.
Yeah, they're not in the top 5. The president of Israel said something super genocidal, but whatever. That's mostly ceremonial. Okay, Benjamin Netanyahu had a explicit analogy Hamas to Amalek, who, if you know your Old Testament, Amalek is where there's the commandment to kill every man, woman, child, and suckling babe. But he didn't mean it like that. He wasn't he wasn't referring to he wasn't referring to that. He just meant it was like that in some other way. It's it's just at a certain point, it's guys, what would it take to convince you of this?
Yeah. How explicit do you need a set of steps? Because that really is what was in that leaked intelligence document, was the list of steps for ethnically cleansing Gaza into Egypt. Amazing stuff.
Yeah, and also just literally there are 2.3 million people, right, living in the Gaza Strip, and over half of them were ordered by the Israeli military to leave their homes. I mean, that that by itself seems pretty, if that had been the only thing that had happened, right, that would seem awfully ethnic cleansing, never mind the hospitals. And I know the first one is in dispute, but not the subsequent ones. Ambulances, schools, churches, mosques, convoys of people fleeing from the areas they were ordered to evacuate from, et cetera, that are ordered that, that have been, I saw going to be talking on Monday's show to Anna Kasparian about her conversation with the PBD guys about this. And there's a line in that conversation. It's look, I think people generally know I'm not the biggest fan of as a sentences, but I liked this one. she, like there's a point in the conversation where she was just like, yeah, as an Armenian, I know a genocide when I see one. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.